Okay, well, let's study together the Gospel of Mark. Let me share the PowerPoint with you that we'll be studying this up. So first of all, let's look here. This is a what we call a minuscule manuscript. So we've seen some with the larger letters. This is one that we would date later. Notice that the letters are kind of scribbly, right? So this is what we call minuscule letters, smaller script letters. Has a title, and you can see there's different colors of ink. And it's kind of like you have to get to know the handwriting of the scribe, right? Now, zoom in a little closer. And by the way, the numbers off to the side, we're just kind of there later to catalog, right? And notice when you zoom in, you see a little bit of a dot structure, right? These little dots. Okay, so what we see here is not in form of papyrus, a plant product, but rather it's kind of like a rough sort of background. The little dots are actually hair follicles. This is animal skin, parchment, that has been cleaned off, hairs been taken off, and so that's what they would write on. Okay, so this is an old version, a Greek manuscript of the Gospel of Mark. So of course, the Gospel of Mark is one of 4 canonical Gospels. We talked about that. And the Gospel of Mark then indeed dates to the middle to late 60s, written to Christians in Rome with the theme of the suffering king. So that's part of our introductory information, right? Authorships, if you look at the information in our textbook, traditionally people believe it was John Mark who actually wrote this gospel, but that he actually got his information from the Apostle Peter while they were in Rome, and the church fathers, the early leaders in Christianity, actually write about that. This is the topic in and of itself that I encourage you to study. And the reason that they say Jesus the suffering king is you see kind of an emphasis on Jesus' passion and the idea of elevating the idea of him being the ruler, the king, as opposed to the emperor in Rome, who at the time was really persecuting the Christians. So there's kind of like almost like a political play going on. And so it would then have been written in order to encourage the Jesus followers in Rome to hang in there and to know that the one that they are following could identify with their suffering. Well, for each one of the Gospels, we're going to look at some uniquenesses in terms of how the narratives are written. And when we look at the Gospel of Mark, we discover that some words are standing out here. The gospel writer here really has an affinity for using certain terms. And the ones that stand out are what we translate typically as words like immediately and beginning to teach. So here we see in Mark 1:21, then they, the disciples that are traveling with Jesus, Jesus and the disciples went into Capernaum, a place in Galilee, and immediately on the Sabbath, Jewish holiday, Jesus entered the synagogue and he began to teach. And so we see words used here that is one word that we typically have to translate as a phrase, eididasken, and then that word that we typically translate as immediately and then euthus. And it's a very typical phrase and word to use. And he began to teach. We see this a lot, kind of noticing that the writer of the Gospel of Mark really emphasizes that Jesus went around and was perceived as a teacher, a rabbi. But that word immediately is really intriguing. Euthus is what you pronounce it in Greek. We're often translated immediately, at once, and then. And it gives that idea of pushing the narrative, okay? Unique to the Gospel of Mark. In fact, welcome to Nerdland. If you kind of map that out, its occurrence, the usage of that word throughout the narrative, it would look something like this. So on the x-axis, you see the chapter numbers of the Gospel of Mark, and then on the Y, you just see the frequency of the word uses. Now, of course, this is completely arbitrary, right? Remember that the text did not have chapter numbers to begin with, but this just gives us a way to kind of handle the text. And you notice right off the bat that the opening chapter, it just opens up and the word euthus is used a lot. Chapters 2 and 3 are very brief. And then when we come to chapters 4, 5, and 6, you see it's used again. And so it's kind of, you can kind of just come up with like a curve here. And then you see it really tapers off, right? The end of it, it just barely uses it. And so the question is why? Well, the best way that we can come up with it is to kind of think of it in terms of NASCAR. If you don't like NASCAR, just don't mind me. But I actually married into a racing family. And so, you know, I've been around that kind of sport, if you will, for a while. And I remember when I first met my husband, going to one of these racing tracks and witnessing my first race. And I remember they went all night around and around and around, and it was so loud, and it lasted till the wee hours of the morning. They give you earplugs. Back then, you could stand in the pits. That's now forbidden, you know, because some dangerous things had happened. And the sound was deafening, and it was so fast. It's so loud. And then when they were done, and I thought, okay, thank the Lord they're done. It actually turned out those were the pre-runs. Now they have determined who were starting where, and then they were going to do the races, right? Well, after the races, we got home in the morning. It was like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. I remember getting out of the car. This is in the middle of country Alabama. I remember we get out of the car and it was real quiet there. And then after a night of such fast-paced movement and such loud sounds, I got out of the car and I heard something. And I said, what do I hear? And of course, you can hear by my accent, you know, I'm from elsewhere. So I didn't really know what the sounds were. And my husband said, oh, those are tree frogs and cicadas or whatever. And in the distance, there were like bobcats. And I heard all these sounds that I had never noticed before. Because in contrast with that loudness, I now notice these small little sounds. I think that's the best way to look at what's going on here. The narrative goes really fast. The story of Jesus is told in the first 10, 11 chapters or so really, really fast. When you read the stories, Jesus goes from one place to the next, and you can barely keep up with it. And then when we get to the last part of the narrative of Mark, it slows down. It's like you open up the car door and you listen and you can hear the details. And that's when we enter into the final week of Jesus' life. It's like everything goes into slow motion. Not much euthus, no more immediately and then and rushing. The story is told in slow motion, so we catch all the details. In fact, you see that in the text. There's a transition in chapter 10, 11 or so, and they were on the road and they were going up to Jerusalem where Jesus' suffering and death takes place, right? And Jesus was walking ahead of them and they were amazed. And those who followed were afraid. And he took the 12, his core disciples, students aside, and he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, see, we're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man, a title he uses right for himself, will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, the religious leaders. They will condemn him to death, and then they will hand him over to the non-Jews, the Gentiles. And then it starts to spell out. In the Gospel of Luke, Luke says, and Jesus resolutely set his face toward Jerusalem. So this is a literary device, a narrative device to pull us into the story and slow down. I wanted to look at some other things that we can glean from just looking at a narrative. In Mark 5, there is a story that calls our attention. Now, sometimes people read stories and they try to find things between the text that really aren't there, but we should always pay attention to some observations. So I want you to work with me here. We're going to pull this up on our Bible app, remember, YouVersion. So Mark 5, there is a story where there is a woman that's healed by Jesus, and then interwoven in there, there's a story of a young girl being raised from the dead by Jesus. So as I read this story, I want you to look for the following things. I want you to pay attention to what name is used for the females. How does Jesus refer to these two females? there are numbers mentioned. What numbers are mentioned? And then how do people respond to circumstances in the story? What kind of emotional responses? What's going on culturally? And then the way that the author is writing this narrative. There's a choice, right, in how to write that. What kind of contrasts are implied? What are we supposed to pick up on? Okay, you ready? Okay, so keep these questions in mind as I read the story. Here we go. I'm looking at my app, right? When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea, that's the Sea of Galilee. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, that's Jesus, he fell at his feet, and he begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately, there you have it, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And immediately, Euthus, aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you all make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." They laughed at him. And then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went into where the child was. He took her by the hand and said, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately Euthus, the girl, got up and began to walk about. And she was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. And he strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. Wow, did you hear it? Did you hear the references to the females? They're both daughters, right? What about the numbers? How old was the daughter? 12. How long had the woman with the issue of blood, the hemorrhage, been sick? 12 years. So for the duration of the life of the sick girl, that woman had been sick as well. So here's the kicker, right? In that culture, if a woman was sick, or anybody was sick, if you had any kind of issue with production or issue of bodily fluids, you were deemed impure, right? Unclean. And that meant that you were out of your common communal life. You could not participate in the community. That was equal to a social death. That means that woman was dead already. She was dead. The little girl wasn't dead yet. So Jesus actually prioritizes accordingly. Now, to the people who are standing around, they're like, "We've seen this woman around for 12 years. Geez, wait a little bit. Let's go to the girl." And in our Western thinking, we're thinking it's a young kid. But over there, children died all the time. Did you know that 60%, 60, of the children would die before the age of 16? They never made their 16th birthday. Everyone knew death at a young age in their families. So it's not the age of the child. It's the fact that there are two people in dire circumstances, and Jesus equally attends to all people. Now, the lady did not just have any kind of bleeding, she has a female issue, right? She's been menstruating for 12 straight years. Imagine her weakness. Imagine her desperation. He even talks about it. In the Gospel of Luke, the story is told, and it says that she had seen countless doctors and no one can heal her, which means she has to live away from her family. She cannot touch anything. Anything, if you sit on the people go like, don't sit there. She sat there. So she might as well have been dead. So she's desperate and she comes up to Jesus and she has heard that he does magic. She thinks if I just touch him. And when Jesus figures that somebody has touched him, he asks that, and it's kind of like scoffing. And her response is not, to fall around his neck and give him a big hug. She is terrified. Now, why would she be terrified? I mean, wouldn't you just be amazed that this guy actually pays attention to you? Well, it's because, remember, Jesus is presented throughout the Gospel of Mark as a teacher, a rabbi, a religious teacher. And religious teachers had to stay pure. And especially if he's on his way to see a leader of a synagogue, it's presumably so that he's going to participate in religious ceremonies and obligations. And if you are impure as a Jewish male, you cannot do so. You have to go to cleansing rituals and probably be unclean for 3 days. So she knows any other rabbi at any other day, there's a high likelihood that they're livid. They're going to be so angry. And so she's terrified and she's waiting for a tongue lashing. And Jesus is kind. Jesus does not care about cultural and religious expectations. He cuts through all that stuff. And then he calls her daughter. You belong to the community. You belong to the family of God. You don't have to live on the fringes. And then he still goes with the family of Jairus, right? And then he still attends to this young lady and he raises her from the dead. And there are people, they're skeptic, cultural backdrop, right? They laugh. They don't believe in Jesus' power over death. So here it is contrast. It doesn't matter what socioeconomic class you belong to. Jesus cares. And he sees through that. So I want you to kind of, when you read, I want you to kind of look for dynamics like that, okay? Moving right along, and of course you have been looking at the Gospel of Luke and Gospel of John as well, so that's why we don't spend this extensive period of time. We keep seeing this immediately, and then. So we see that he travels back and forth. Jesus, he uses boats to get across the Sea of Galilee. And so he goes before the students. The students, he sends them away ahead of him to the other side to minister there. And he sends the other people away. And you kind of figure, well, Jesus is on his own. They're in that boat. And in the middle of the night, Jesus actually walks on the water, comes to them. So that's kind of like a freaky sort of story. And so, yes, the disciples are, out of their mind. You also got to realize the folklore belief here, right? They've grown up in ancient Near East where they believe that ancient gods live in these waters. They occupy these waters. Even during the time of the Greek and Greco-Roman era where we find ourselves, they believe that like Neptune, god of the sea, occupies the sea. And Jesus just walks on top of it. He just walks right over their religious belief system. Just takes it on just like that. When you're a believer living in Rome, where you have all these Greco-Roman gods, and you hear of somebody just walking over it, whoa, you take a step back. You're like, who is this that he just defies? He defies all these gods. And so Jesus speaks to his disciples as he walks up to that, and he says, take heart, be encouraged. It is I, not somebody else, not some other god, not some other power. And he says, do not be afraid, which really means stop fearing. You can stop fearing now. You can stop your fear of this whole pantheon, of this whole other religious system. You can stop that. I have come. And the emphasis, ego eimi. You see the yellow letters there? That's how the Greek sounds. It really is emphatic. It really says, I am. I am the one. Focus on me. Well, then moving right along, there's actually kind of like a turning point in the narrative in a different way, right? We've looked at how that flow of of the youth supervisor. But narratively speaking, in the order of events, there's another turning point, and that is what they call, theologically speaking, the transfiguration. At some point, there's a story in Mark 9 when Jesus goes, it says up a mountain. It's more like a big old hill. You can see it there. Jesus goes up a mountain and he takes his close students with him again. When he goes up that mountain, look at that. It says in verse 2, 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain, high hill by themselves. And he was transfigured. He's changed before them. His clothes become dazzling white. No one on earth can produce that color. And then some important individuals from the Old Testament story appear before him talking with Jesus. So Peter, one of the disciples, goes, "Whoa, teacher, it's good that you're here. I guess it's kind of like a Jewish tradition, so let me make some holy dwelling places." And it's kind of, it's overwhelming. Notice in verse 7, then a cloud overshadowed them, and then from the cloud comes a voice. "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." This also happened at Jesus' baptism, right? It says here, "This is my beloved." Notice that every time that there's an interaction that makes clear that Jesus is not just any man, there's a cloud. We're going to see that also when Jesus ascends into the heavens. And there is a cloud, and it says that as the people gaze and Jesus is taken from them and he goes back to heaven, that the clouds take him, right? It's at the end of the Gospel of Luke. It's the beginning of Acts, and we pick up on the story. And there's actually a story, spoiler alert, at the very end of the Bible, it talks about Jesus coming back one day. And it says when he comes back, everybody will see him as he travels on the clouds. Well, it has nothing to do with clouds and gas. It has everything to do with, remember, this is written to Christians in Rome. It has everything to do with the expectation pattern of the believers in Rome. If you lived in Rome, you believed that the gods would travel on clouds. Remember, like Percy Jackson and lightning bolts and people and God traveling in crowds. This is the close hint. If you were a believer in Rome, before you even read on and hear that there's a voice coming from the clouds, you already know that the moment it mentions the presence of clouds, you already know the people who are there, there's something there. This is a divine appearance. And so it's an indication for us that this is something that indicates divinity. Who is this Jesus? He's more than just a rabbi, okay? So that's what's going on here, and we have a turn in the story. Well, we have read that in light of these signs, these omens, clouds appearing, we have looked at contrast in stories like the woman with the issue of blood and the daughter of Jairus. I want us to look a little bit more at what we call a redactional reading, where you see how the person who put together the gospel organized stories in such a way that when you follow it, you know that the events didn't happen necessarily in this order or at that time frame, but it's told in a story, like you adapt the story in such a way that it makes a point. So we're going to follow now the text and see what the importance is of it being put together in this way. So look at Mark 10 here, Mark 10, 13 to 16. If you grew up in any kind of church setting, if your church practiced infant baptism or something that the Baptist practice at UMSB or evangelical tradition, if your church practices a child dedication, then sometimes this passage is read there. It's about children, and it tells about the occurrence where Jesus has children brought to him. People were bringing little children to him that he might touch them. And the idea is here that Jesus would lay hands on their head and pray a Jewish prayer over them, okay? And the disciples spoke sternly to them. But when Jesus saw this, he was indignant and said to them, "Let the little children come to me. Don't stop them. It's to such that the kingdom of God belongs." Whoa, he says, this is what it makes me thinking about, but I'm thinking about building a special community. I want people to be like these children. Truly I tell you all, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it. Whoa. So then he takes them in his arms, laid his hands on them, and blesses them. It's a Jewish tradition, right? So, wow, that's quite something, right? So he says, when I want to build my kingdom, and that's the kind of language, right, that resonates with the times. But he pretty much says, when I want to build a community with God's values, right, when God shows up, I want people to be like these children. So don't shoot them off, bring them here. So what do children have that other people don't have? Now, before you say little children are innocent, I want you to kind of think about that, right? Because I'm a mom and I have little ones. And let me tell you, they're not always innocent, right? They want that toy. That toy is mine. That's mine. Or the first word was not mama, mama, dada. The first word was no, no, no. So it's not necessarily that degree of innocence. It's more like little children are unassuming. They assume the best in this world. In children, other children, they assume the best in people. They assume the best in the world around them. Sadly, the world around them is often not a good place. Some of you may have grown up in a household that was not a good place, and I am so sorry about that. But even the households that are safe places, that doesn't mean that they don't at some point get a taste of the fact that this is not always a good world. But children are unassuming. If you say, hey, you want to come over here and play here? They're like, sure, yeah, I'll go with you. And we even as parents then warn them, don't go with these people, you know? Okay, so Jesus says, that's what I'm looking for. When I say, come, follow me, let's build a community with people that follow God's values. He's looking for just like a child that says, oh, okay, sure. Not when we go like, yeah, but what does that mean? Do I have to give up this or that? Okay, so the writer of Mark wants to make that known. So right after the story, he moves on and he tells the story of just such a person who comes up and does that, okay? So he says, he goes on and says, as he was setting out on a journey, a man ran up. So notice that he purposefully places these stories one after another. So we must pay attention to this. Why are these stories told in such an order? So a man ran up, asked him, good teacher, good rabbi, what must I do to enter eternal life? With this code here for what must I do to join your everlasting community? And Jesus says, well, what are you going to be good? No one is good but God alone. Here's what you know from the Old Testament story. This is God's plan. This is the plan for God's community. And the guy says, well, teacher, I've done all that ever since I was young. Not really up to that. And Jesus says, well, you know, why don't you go back to those days of just unassumingly living? Why don't you give it away and then come and follow me? And the guy says, it's a little tough. Maybe not. So now this is an example of what people can be like when they don't act unassumingly. Then continue to read the story. Then Jesus looks around and has a teachable moment with his disciples, his students. And he says, how hard it will be for those who have goodies to enter into the community of God. And the disciples, they're just astonished. And because those are the kind of rich people, they live in the Hollywood of the time. Those were the, you know, internet influencers, Instagram influencers. Those are the cool ones. And Jesus says to them, children, how hard it is to enter the kingdom of God. He says, let's just make it ridiculous, right? It's easier for a camel, huge animal, to crawl through the eye of a needle than for someone who's rich to enter the kingdom of God. And they're just astonished. Notice that he calls them children. Check now. It started, go back here. It started with the example of Jesus actually looking for childlike young persons to be unassuming. Then a person who presumably is younger because he's kind of like in the throes of his life, a little bit younger, who says, nah, I'm not really up for that. And then Jesus calls his disciples children. They're in the young stage of his life. So what do we get from the fact that we notice that these stories are actually placed one after another? Well, Jesus calls his disciples children. In other words, he says, listen, you all were and are like that. You unassumingly followed me. When I came up to you, when we walked by the water and I said, come follow me, you didn't say, well, Jesus, I don't know. I like being a fisherman. What's in it for me? You left your net and you followed me. Each one of you did that. And I think you get that by following the flow of the story. Oh, there's your camel. Yeah, no, doesn't fit through a needle. Okay, so we've seen several ways of reading. Now I want to show you how to read in context, which means you look what comes before, what comes after. This is often called the widow's mite or widow's coin if you happen to have grown up in church or in the context of the university if you've heard some stories maybe in chapel service. So typically, this story is told from verses 41 to 44. If you have a Bible that has little subtitles in it, it puts the title right before verse 41. So if you read there, it says, Jesus sat down opposite the treasury. So he's in the temple courts, right? We are now in chapter 12. So we're in the last week of Jesus' life. He's in Jerusalem. He knows he's going to suffer and die. And he has some teachable moments with his students. And so he watched the crowd putting money into the treasury. They're bringing money to religion. Many rich people put in large sums of money. And then in verse 42, a poor widow came and put in 2 small copper coins, which are worth a penny. I mean, it's like nothing. Then he calls his disciples and says, come over here. Truly, I tell you all, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the treasury. I mean, this is probably the last stuff that she had. And then notice in verse 44, he says, for all of them have contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in everything she had, all she had to live on. I want you to take a moment. If you've heard this story before, I want you to take a moment and ask yourself, what's happening here in verse 44? Maybe verse 43 and verse 44. Is Jesus saying here that people should all be like this widow? Or is this a simple statement? Does he ask them, look and see what's happening? He doesn't say, everybody, wow, you should be like this woman. Does he say, you should be like the people who throw money in the treasury? No, there are no value statements here. It's an observation. He says, come and see. This is what they do. This is what she does. Nothing. Too often, this passage, way too often, is preached in the sense that we should all be like the widow and give our very last pennies to religion. It's not here. How do I know? Read before this. Start reading at verse 38. Look at this. As Jesus was teaching, remember, final week. There's a reason why this text is here. He said, beware, watch out. Watch out to the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. Look at verse 40. They devour, not just eat, but they just eat. They shove it in their mouth. They devour widows' houses. And for the sake of just appearance, say long prayers. And look what Jesus says then. Those kind of religious leaders, they will receive the greater condemnation. Ooh, they're in for it. And then next it says, he sat down opposite the treasury, verse 42, and then a poor widow comes in. This is no coincidence. We're supposed to see that next it's show and tell time. Here comes one. Here comes one of these women that they eat. They eat them. They devour them. It's nasty. So what are we supposed to take away from that? And why is Jesus so upset with these religious leaders? Jesus does not like the temple. Well, and what is this about them eating houses? Well, in the old part of the story, remember we started out with the 6-part story with an interlude of the Bible. In the old part of the story, when the people come and take the land of Palestine, they all got a piece of land, and there was a group that they didn't necessarily get land, which was really a part of what people liked at the time in antiquity. Instead, they attended to religious services, and like the tribe of Levi. They took care of the religious centers, but eventually became like a temple, and the religious rituals where people would come and they would have religious services, and then whatever was left over they would use for the families. But they did not necessarily own land, right? By the time that Jesus comes on the scene, all these religious leaders, they owned all the land around Jerusalem and its surrounding. And then they would rent it out to people, park out the land, and they would just rent houses or work the little property. Well, then they would go around and they would come to get the rent. So if the husband died and there was no older son to take care of that, then, they would go to the widows and say, your rent is due, not just for your house, but for, the harvest. So something else that happened at the time was part of the religious system was that you would bring a portion of that, of your income, of the gain of your harvest, the gain of your garden, whatever, you would bring a portion of that to the religious institution, like a temple. And the reason that was done so, we also learned from the Old Testament, is that it was brought there so that they could distribute it to people who had need. It talks about that in the Old Testament story, that God takes care of the fatherless and the widows. God says, I got it. And he puts people in charge of that. So if we all just kind of do that, and we share some, we bring some there, then they can distribute that as needed. Well, you would think it's a great system. The people there pray. Jesus actually says, listen to the temple. He says, you've made it a place of robbers. When Jesus comes, he goes like, oh my goodness, you'll have like money places where you can exchange and sell things. And he goes, that's not the idea. You're supposed to come here to pray for the people. And then as the people have needs, you can distribute that to the people in need. Well, so if you catch like somebody like this, if somebody becomes a widow and she had a house there, but her husband died, you should be able then to go to the religious community, to the temple, and say, my husband died. I have no one to attend to the field. My rent is due. Can someone help? And the idea is that they say, come here, we got you. We'll take care of that. We'll cover your rent. We'll make sure that you're not out on the street. Let us see what we can do. That's the idea. Instead, they say, well, your rent is due, and that land is actually ours. Oh, in addition, you're supposed to pay 10% of what you have in your harvest. Actually, we're doing the double tithe. We're fixing some things on the temple. So 20% plus your rent, give it to them. And then the lady says, I have nothing left. And they're like, well, we'll take the house. They devour widows' houses. And the widow is still intimidated by the religious system and the picture it gives of God. And she takes whatever last coin she has, takes it to the temple and puts it in there. So shame on us if we then end up preaching that we should be like that widow, because we should never be in that place. We should never end up there, because instead we should be the solution to the poor. We should be the ones giving to them. Interesting, right? You get that from knowing the context. Well, as the story goes on and we get to the end of Jesus's life, it ends on the occasion of the feast of Passover, and so there's preparations in Jerusalem, and it's always in. Have you ever wondered? It says Jesus says to his disciples, go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Have you ever wondered if the city swells up to like twice or three times the size, how they would know what man it is? Well, if you look real closely here in this picture, who are carrying the water? Do you see it? It's the women who carry the water. So one of the things that would have given it away is it's a man. So just interesting. At the moment of arrest of Jesus, everybody flees into the night. Only the Gospel of Mark says this. It says a certain young man was following Jesus, was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth, which means the outer garment is gone. So they, the arresting guards, caught hold of him. So he frees himself and he runs off. He leaves also the inner garment. And then he ran off naked. Why would people put it in there? Well, in antiquity, it was customary that the author would insert him or herself into the text. It's probably all male authors here. And so a lot of people think that this is autobiographical, that the one who wrote the text actually once upon a time was the one that preferred to flee naked rather than owning up to it being Jesus. And so sometimes we can run off scared, naked, and end up years later making a difference for Jesus. And of course, it's time for crucifixion. We studied that in a separate section. At 9 o'clock in the morning, they crucified him and they put up a charge, the King of the Jews. Joseph of Arimathea, he was a member of the religious council. They were not all like really into the money thing. He actually was one, together with a man named Nicodemus, that was like that news that Jesus had brought. And so after Jesus had died on the cross, he actually went, and it says boldly, to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. It's boldly, it's bold, right? Because nobody wanted to be associated with someone who was crucified, because people who were crucified were either insurrectionists against the Roman regime, not good to be associated with, or they were the lowest of the low who had done something wrong, not good to be associated with. At this point, no one knew that Jesus would rise. So he risked everything for a dead Jesus. Man, that guy's a hero. And then it ends with the empty grave. Luke has a very brief ending, but there is a call to preach, and that call is given to the widows, to the women. So Mark ends right there at verse 8. It says, so they went out, the women, fled from the tomb. They're kind of terrified and amazed. And they at first say nothing. From the other Gospels, we learn that they went and told the male disciples. But that's how it ends. So the original, the first renditions of the Gospel of Mark stopped right there at verse 8. And then later on, people said, hey, we should have a longer ending like the other ones have. And that's kind of the later thing. And so that is where it stops for us here.